The Typhoon didn't completely change the course of the war, but what it evolved into, the Tempest, became one of the best fighters of the war, and almost nobody tells that part of the story. And that's a problem, because the Typhoon on its own doesn't make sense. It's a chapter ripped out of a longer book, and when you read it in isolation, you end up doing what most people do. You either overrate it as some kind of war-winning wonder weapon, or you dismiss it as a death trap that got lucky. Both readings are wrong. The real story is an evolution. 4 aircraft, 1 designer, a decade of iteration. Hurricane, Typhoon, Tempest, Sea Fury. Each one built on the bones of the last, each one engineered to kill fewer of its own pilots than the one before. The man drawing the line through all 4 was Sir Sydney Camm, chief designer at Hawker Aircraft from 1925 until the end of his career. Responsible for more than 50 aircraft types, knighted for his contributions, and almost pathologically committed to the idea that you don't start from scratch when something doesn't work. You fix it. Then you fix the fix. Then you fix that. The Hurricane was his starting point. First flight, the 6th of November 1935, Brooklands aerodrome, Flight Lieutenant P.W.S. Bulman at the controls. It was, honestly, a transitional machine. Monoplane wings bolted onto a fuselage still built from tubular steel and covered in fabric. More biplane thinking in a monoplane body than anyone wanted to admit. But it worked. It was rugged, forgiving to fly. It equipped more squadrons during the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire did, and accounted for the majority of aerial victories. 500 Hurricanes were in squadron service by September 1939. But Camm already knew its limits. The wing was thick, a Clark YH section with a root thickness to chord ratio of roughly 18%, tapering to 12% at the tip. It carried 8.303 Browning machine guns, which were adequate against lightly armoured bombers in 1940 and increasingly useless against anything else. The Hurricane was a beginning, not a destination. So Camm reached for more. The Air Ministry's specification F-18/37 called for a new interceptor powered by one of 2 experimental engines, the Rolls-Royce Vulture or the Napier Sabre. Camm designed aircraft for both. The Vulture-powered Tornado died when Rolls-Royce abandoned that engine to focus on the Merlin. The Sabre-powered Typhoon survived. Its first prototype, P-5212, flew on 24th of February 1940 with Philip Lucas in the cockpit. On paper, formidable. The Napier Sabre was a 24-cylinder H-configuration sleeve valve engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, one of the most powerful piston engines of the entire war. The airframe was big, heavy, built to absorb all that fury. But here's the thing, Camm carried the thick wing forward. The Typhoon's wing used a NACA 4-digit series aerofoil, with a maximum thickness-to-chord ratio of approximately 19% at the root, tapering to 12% at the tip. That number needs context. The Spitfire's wing root sat at about 13%. The FW190, the very aircraft the Typhoon was supposed to counter, roughly 15%. The P-51 Mustang with its laminar flow wing, about 15.1%. The Typhoon's wing was, by a considerable margin, the thickest of any frontline fighter in the war. At low altitude and moderate speed, thick wings are perfectly fine. Good lift, plenty of internal volume for fuel, guns, undercarriage, no drama. But physics doesn't care about your design intentions. As an aircraft climbs into thinner air and accelerates toward higher Mach numbers, the airflow over a thick wing's curved upper surface speeds up. And the thicker the wing, the more it speeds up. At the Typhoon's performance ceiling, something ugly happened. Even though the aircraft as a whole was well below the speed of sound, the air flowing over the thickest point of the wing was locally reaching transonic velocities. Shock waves formed on the wing surface. Airflow separated violently behind the shock. Drag spiked. Controls went heavy or stopped responding altogether. The aircraft hit a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. Above 20,000 feet, the Typhoon's performance fell apart. It couldn't compete with the BF-109G, couldn't match the FW-190A at the medium and high altitudes where the European air war was actually being fought. And so, by elimination rather than design, the Typhoon was shoved into the low-level role, the one place where that enormous Sabre engine could deliver speed the Luftwaffe couldn't match below 5,000 feet. The Typhoon wasn't designed as a ground attack aircraft. It was designed as an interceptor that couldn't intercept. That distinction matters. And it matters even more because the thick wing wasn't just robbing performance, it was killing pilots. In power dives, routine in combat, the airflow over that 19% wing reached transonic velocities far sooner than it would have over a thinner section. The shock waves and violently separated air didn't just cause drag. They hammered the tail surfaces with aerodynamic loads the structure was never built to take. Compressibility, that's the technical term. Think of it this way. At normal flight speeds, air behaves like a thin, easily parted fluid, and engineers could safely ignore how it compressed. But at the edge of the transonic, that assumption breaks down. Air starts behaving more like a liquid. Density changes become significant. Forces that simply didn't exist at lower speeds appear with lethal suddenness. On the Typhoon, those forces ripped the tail off. Elevator flutter developed in high-speed dives as shock-induced turbulence battered the horizontal stabilizer. The joint between the rear fuselage and the empennage, that was the weak point. Through 1942 and 1943, Typhoons entered dives and never pulled out. Aircraft found crashed with their tails cleanly separated. Estimates vary by source, but somewhere between several dozen and over 100 Typhoon pilots died from tail failures before effective fixes were implemented. And compounding the horror was a second, quieter killer. Carbon monoxide from the Napier Sabre's exhaust manifold was leaking through gaps in the firewall into the cockpit. Pilots were losing consciousness at altitude, slumping over the controls, crashing. When they were found dead in wreckage that also showed structural damage, nobody could tell if it was the tail failure, the CO poisoning, or both. That diagnostic confusion delayed solutions to both problems. The interim fix for the tail was blunt. External fishplate reinforcements riveted across the joint between the rear fuselage and the tail unit, physically bracing the connection against forces it was never meant to bear. The fishplates worked. They reduced catastrophic separations, but they were an admission. This airframe, as designed, had reached the limit of what patching could achieve. Now, about those guns. There's a version of the Typhoon story that talks about it carrying 12.303 Browning machine guns and leaves it there, as though that's what the aircraft took into Normandy. That version is describing an aircraft that barely existed. The Typhoon Mark 1A, the Browning armed variant, accounted for roughly 105 machines out of approximately 3,317 total production. 105. The overwhelming majority were MKI-Bs, armed with 4 20mm Hispano Mk2 cannons, genuinely devastating weapons that could tear apart locomotives, armoured vehicles and aircraft with a few well-placed rounds. Of 3,317 Typhoons built, over 3,200 carried cannon. To that was later added the weapon that became the aircraft's signature: 8 RP-3 rocket projectiles, 60-pound warheads each, slung on launch rails beneath the wings. 4 Hispano cannons and 8 rockets. That was the Typhoon that actually fought the war. As it only carried .303 Brownings, is a bit like covering the Sherman tank, but only showing the 75mm variant and pretending the 76mm never happened. The Sabre engine deserves one honest sentence. It was unreliable early on, it leaked carbon monoxide, and it improved dramatically through its production life until, by the Tempest era, later marks were significantly more powerful and better sealed. Even the engine got better through iteration. That's the pattern. But the Typhoon's most important legacy wasn't its airframe or its engine or even its armament. It was a tactic. Cab rank. Named after the London taxi rank, cabs queued up, waiting for their next fare. In the skies over Normandy in 1944, flights of Typhoons orbited at predetermined altitudes in a stack over the battlefield, waiting. On the ground below, forward air controllers operated from visual control posts, sometimes called contact cars, positioned close to the front line. When a controller spotted a target, tanks massing, artillery firing, a strong point blocking an advance, he radioed the next available flight of Typhoons with a map reference and popped coloured smoke. The Typhoons peeled off, attacked with rockets and cannon, and the next flight in the stack moved down to wait. Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst of 2nd Tactical Air Force is widely credited as the driving force behind its operational deployment. And what made it revolutionary was this. Before cab rank, close air support was pre-planned hours or days ahead. By the time aircraft arrived, the target had moved, the situation had changed, the moment had passed. Cab rank made air support nearly immediate. A ground commander could call for a strike and have Typhoons overhead in minutes. At the Battle of Mortain in August 1944, German armour launched a counterattack aimed at cutting off the American breakout from Normandy. Typhoons in cab rank formations hit them relentlessly. Post-war analysis showed actual tank kills were lower than wartime claims. They always are. But the suppressive and disruptive effect on German operations was enormous. At the Falaise Gap, retreating German forces caught in a pocket were subjected to continuous attack. On October 24, 1944, massed Typhoons hit the German 15th Army headquarters at Dordrecht in 3 coordinated waves, killing 2 generals and 70 staff officers in a single operation. The lineage from there to now is unbroken. The ground-based Forward Air Controller became the Forward Air Controller Airborne of Korea and Vietnam, then the Joint Terminal Attack Controller, the JTAC, of NATO doctrine today. The A-10 Warthog's entire concept of operations, loitering near the battlefield and responding to ground calls, is cab rank with a jet engine. When a JTAC in Afghanistan called an F-16 onto a compound, the tactical grammar of that exchange was written by Typhoon pilots and their controllers in the hedgerows of Normandy. And that's when everything changed. Because even while the Typhoon was pioneering cab rank and proving itself at low level, Camm was already building the aircraft that would solve everything the Typhoon couldn't. He called it the Typhoon II. The name tells you everything. This wasn't a new concept. It was the same concept, fixed. The most critical change was the wing. Camm's team designed an entirely new semi-elliptical planform with a thickness-to-chord ratio of 14.5% at the root, down from the Typhoon's approximately 19%. The wing was roughly 5 inches thinner, and the aerodynamic difference was transformative. The thinner section delayed compressibility effects, pushed the critical Mach number higher, slashed drag at the speeds that had crippled the Typhoon. But a thinner wing meant less internal volume. The fuel tanks and undercarriage that fit inside the Typhoon's fat wing couldn't fit inside the new one, which forced a cascade of redesign. Repositioned undercarriage, radiators relocated from the chin scoop into wing leading edges on some marks, and a fuselage lengthened by 21 inches to accommodate displaced fuel and improve directional stability. That extra length also moved the horizontal stabilizer further from the wing's turbulent wake. The tail unit was completely redesigned. Spring tab ailerons gave the pilot lighter, more responsive roll control. By this point, the redesign had gone so far that calling it a Typhoon 2 was misleading. The Air Ministry agreed. The aircraft was redesignated the Tempest. The first Tempest prototype flew in September 1942. By April 1944, the Tempest Mark V, powered by the Napier Sabre, now in its more reliable later marks, had entered squadron service. And almost immediately, it got a mission perfectly suited to everything Camm had engineered into it: the V-1 flying bomb. Hitler's buzz bombs flew at roughly 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Most Allied fighters couldn't catch them. The Tempest could. That low-altitude speed, inherited directly from the Typhoon's design DNA, the same characteristic that had made the Typhoon useless as a high-altitude interceptor, made the Tempest lethal against V-1s in Operation Diver during the summer of 1944. Pilots chased the pilotless bombs from behind, used deflection shooting, or, in the most audacious technique of all, flew in close formation with a V-1, slid their wingtip beneath the missile's stubby wing, and used the aerodynamic disruption to flip its primitive gyroscopic autopilot, sending it into a terminal dive over open countryside rather than over London. Tempests claimed 638 V-1s destroyed, the highest total of any single aircraft type in the anti-diver campaign, representing roughly a third of all V-1s destroyed by fighters. Squadron leader Joseph Berry alone was credited with over 60 V-1 kills, making him the top-scoring anti-V-1 ace of the war. The Tempest went on to fight in the final months over Western Europe, engaging FW-1 90D9s and ME-262 jets. Squadrons 3, 56, 80, 274 and 486, the New Zealand squadron, all operated Tempests. Multiple marks followed. The Mark II with the Bristol Centaurus radial engine, the Mark VI for tropical service. The aircraft that had started life as the Typhoon but fixed had become one of the finest piston engine fighters of the war. But Camm wasn't done iterating. After the war, the Tempest's design evolved one final time into the Hawker Sea Fury. First flight in 1945, powered by the Bristol Centaurus and widely considered by aviation historians to be the finest piston engine fighter ever built. It served in Korea, where a Sea Fury pilot, Lieutenant Peter Carmichael of 802 Naval Air Squadron, shot down a MiG-15 jet, a piston engine fighter killing a jet in combat. The Sea Fury was the proof that every painful lesson of the Typhoon, the thick wing, the tail failures, the engine problems, the compressibility, all of it, had been worth something. The DNA of an aircraft that killed its own pilots in 1942 produced, through relentless iteration, one of the greatest fighters in history by 1945. That's the story Sydney Camm was telling across a decade of design. Not one brilliant aircraft, an evolution. Each flaw diagnosed, each fix implemented, each death paid forward into an airframe that wouldn't make the same mistake again. Hurricane to Typhoon to Tempest to Sea Fury. The Typhoon only makes sense as the middle chapter. Which brings us to who actually lived that middle chapter. Not Camm at his drawing board in Kingston. The pilots. Men of 175 Squadron and dozens of other units who climbed into a machine they knew might kill them before the enemy got the chance. Flew it at rooftop height into walls of flak and came back. Or didn't. Trusting an imperfect aircraft because it was the one they'd been given. They called it the tiffy, not with irony, with the kind of rough affection you develop for something that's simultaneously trying to get you killed and keeping you alive. Typhoon pilot loss rates were among the highest of any RAF fighter type. Tail failures, flak exposure on low-level attack runs, engine reliability in the early days. These weren't statistics, they were people. And some of their families are watching this right now. So here's what matters. Behind every engineering iteration in this story, every redesigned wing section, every fish plate riveted over a cracking tail joint, every improved mark of the Sabre engine, there was a pilot who flew the version before the fix. Who was, in the most literal sense, the test case for a problem that would be solved in the next model. The men who flew the Typhoon paid the cost of being the middle chapter in someone else's design evolution. They didn't get the Tempest. They didn't get the Sea Fury. They got the tiffy, with its thick wing and its suspect tail, and its cockpit that might be slowly filling with carbon monoxide. And they flew it into combat anyway. This story belongs to them, not to us. If you want more stories told properly, subscribe. We've got plenty to tell.